I want to cast our minds back to the 24th of August, 1918. Douglas Haig arrives at the Canadian Corps headquarters with its most important operational assignment of the war. More important than Amiens, Passchendaele, or Vimy, the Canadian Corps was going to advance 27 kilometers through 6 different defensive positions, cross the canal, some of the strongest defenses on the Western Front, and seize high ground overlooking Cambrai. In the process, they would shatter the linchpin of German defenses in the Western Front. Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps, would call this the Corps' hardest battle, but also its greatest victory. This presentation is a description of this battle. So I'm going to start by setting the operational context, look at the terrain, the defenders, and then I'm going to break down each day's operations through a series of animated maps that highlight the forces involved, the objectives, and then what actually transpired. In between, I'm going to have 12 factors that assisted or hindered the Canadian Corps' operations, and then tie together with a conclusion, and then we can get to the question and answer session. So operationally, the battle really starts in the aftermath of the Amiens offensive. By the 15th of August, that attack has run out of steam. Haig moves the Canadians back to the Arras sector and shifts the spearhead of the BEF's operations to Julian Byng's Third Army. The role of the Canadians is to assist that advance towards Bapaume. Now, the attack opens on the 21st of August, but it's immediately apparent to Haig the advance is deliberate, too deliberate in Haig's view. And on the 24th of August, he shifts the spearhead to the Canadians, where they're going to, from the outskirts of Arras, advance to the outskirts of Cambrai. And as you can see, that's going to knock a massive hole in the German line. So what about the terrain? So it consists of a series of ridges and hills that run across the main Canadian advance direction, which is centered on the Arras-Cambrai road, the only all-terrain road in the sector. Now, you have to understand, this area has been heavily fought over in 1917 and 1918. It's seamed with trenches and barbed wire. Every town is flattened. The roads are ruined. This is a very different set of terrain than existed at Amiens. The high ground that's really important in this battle is Montgis-le-Preux, which is that large circle you see on the screen. From there, and if anyone who's ever been there can easily attest as to how much it dominates the surrounding terrain. Now, these ridges are divided by a series of rivers. There's the the Cojal and the Sensee River. Now, you can step across one of these in a single stride, but they have deep banks that limit crossing by vehicles and horses to bridges and fording points. And then to the far east, on the right hand of the screen, is the Canal du Nord, partially flooded, partially completed. It cannot be assault. You cannot run an assault crossing on it. You have to seize bridgeheads to get across. Next point I want to talk about is the defensive zones, because the defenses are an important part of this story. So there's the Hindenburg line. Now that runs on just outside the southern boundary of the Canadian Corps' area of operations. It is the responsibility of the somewhat feckless 17th Corps. Canadians are going to face the Fouché-Wanne Corps line, the front line for First Arras, a new German defensive position built to defend Montgis-le-Preux. There's the old defensive positions, both German and British, dating from the end of First Arras to March 1918. On the other side of that is the Fresnes-Rouvroy line, another pretty strong position. And then the big kahuna, the big one, the Drocourt-Quéant line. Very thick belt of defenses, barbed wire, 30 meters thick, sometimes multiple belts, multiple lines. There's concrete emplacements every 100 meters that are impervious to anything lighter than an 8-inch shell. Built on the principles of the Hindenburg line, it's expected to be a really formidable position. And on the other side of the Canal du Nord is the Marcoing line. Not particularly well maintained, but still an obstacle for a force that's trying to fight their way across the canal. So let's get to the battle. It consists of 3 phases, and the first one is one around diminishing returns. So the offensive opens on the 26th of August. Currie has 3 divisions. has the 2nd and 3rd Canadian and the 51st Highland Division, which is deployed off map at the top of the screen. I don't have time to talk about it, but suffice it to say that given the hindrances and obstacles it had to overcome, it did surprisingly well. And if someone wants to know more about that, that would be a good thing to raise in the question and answer session. So the objective of the Canadians is initially to capture Montgey-le-Preux, more or less the green line that you see. But the expectation is that both divisions will be able to continue to advance, take at least the Fresnes-Rouvroy line and maybe the DQ line. The Canadians are very optimistic all through this battle as to what they expect is going to happen based on their experiences at Amiens. The German defenders consist of 4 divisions. There's the 214th Infantry. It's been in line a long time. The division commander has asked for its relief, but that he was turned down. To its south is the 39th Infantry Division, a pre-war active division. Its resources are split between fighting the Canadians and the British. It's not a well-regarded division. Behind it is the 26th Reserve Division from Württemberg. It has 2 regiments in this battle, but it is considered a crack formation. It's the one that defended Thiepval for 2 months on the Somme in 1916. And its divisional history will say this was its greatest achievement in the war. And the division commander will receive the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max for the division's accomplishments. And to the north is the 35th Infantry Division, a pre-war active division, average kind of formation. It's actually deployed north of the Scarpe River off the map. And so it's only going to reach the battlefield in the late morning and in force in the late afternoon, which will have consequences, which we'll talk about. So the Canadians opened the attack at 3. Currie wanted to use the cover of darkness to shield his attackers from the interlocking machine gun defensive positions. So the 8th Brigade attacks with 2 battalions north of Montgey-le-Preux, 1 south. And you'll hear this over and over again in this presentation. They attacked behind a dense barrage with smoke on a narrow front, punched a hole in the German lines, peeled off forces to take the Germans that were defending these positions. Canadians talk about the Germans firing at phantoms to their front, not recognizing the threat was coming from their flank. After a short pause, the Canadians then envelop and take Montgey-le-Preux. In the process, by late morning, they have effectively destroyed the 214th Infantry Division. It's reduced to bakery detachments, a Landwehr artillery battery, and a company of pioneers that are more or less what's left. Unfortunately, communication delays mean the Reserve Brigade does not move up for an hour and a half. To the south, the 2nd Division attacks at 3 in the morning as well, with the 4th and 6th Brigades. Their initial thrust, they reach the outskirts of Jumab. 6th Brigade is an interesting case because there wasn't enough field artillery available to the Canadians for them to be able to attack on the entire front with the density they thought was necessary. So instead, the 6th Brigade only had a 1,000-yard front that was shelled. But that worked out really successfully. 1 battalion was stacked behind the other. They cut their way through the German on a narrow front, reached the Kojal River, wheeled south, and enveloped the Germans. The German battalion defending Nouvelle Vitasse, the village that you see in the lower left-hand corner, tried to get permission to retreat. The word arrived too late, and the battalion commander and his battalion were either killed or captured in the ensuing action. So now we're back to the next stage of the offensive. 3rd Division commits its 7th Brigade. It's attacking down Infantry Ridge. This was the location where the 2 battalions of the 29th Division ended up getting annihilated or getting surrounded and mostly captured during 1st Arras. 7th Brigade attacks. It's a little bit late because of that communication snafu, and it starts encountering advanced elements of the 35th. And because the zone is so thick with defenses, the attack breaks down and turns into a trench-to-trench attack. The Canadians start suffering casualties, disorganization, use up a lot of ammunition. They're in a very vulnerable position. But before the 35th can mass its forces to counterattack, the Canadians have regained their breath, gotten resupplied, reorganized. So when two regiments of the 35th that have been tasked with taking Monchy-le-Preux attack, they're met with field artillery, heavy artillery, machine guns, Lewis guns, rifle fire, even the strafing from the RAF. The two regiments suffer really heavy casualties and really have no impact on the rest of the engagement. To the south, the 4th and 6th resume their offensive. The 4th takes Jumap, and the 6th has to take two attempts to capture all of Wancourt Tower Ridge, the scene of fierce fighting in 1917. So the two battalions of the 6th fought for 27 hours, made 3 separate attacks, 2 changes of facing, captured more Germans than they suffered casualties. Really an exemplary performance. There was nothing wrong with the infantry of the 2nd Division. High Command, on the other hand, is another matter, and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to talk now about one of the themes, and this is around tempo. One of the big differences between 1917 and 18 is the pace of things. At Passchendaele, the Canadians attacked every 4 to 7 days. There was an attack every day but one in this operation, in some cases as little as 9 hours between the corps order and the attack going in. This results in abbreviated battle procedures, a lot of responsibility getting pushed down. So rather than the Corps issuing a 30-page order, they have an 18-line text that fits on a message pad. It results in ragged coordination, and we'll talk more about that. But what it means is the Germans never get a chance to get their defense set. Every morning they get attacked, they get pushed back, they have to rush up reserves and reinforcements to patch holes, they have to scatter units across the field, their artillery isn't properly tied in, there's constant complaints in German accounts of their own forces getting shelled by their own artillery. And that was the advantage of the tempo. The Germans never quite recover. Now, the next day's attack, it's 9 hours from the time the Corps issued before the attack, but the 2nd Division was not able to match this pace. And the reason is that unlike the 1st, 3rd, and 4th Divisions, it did not get 2 months of open warfare training. As a result, it's just a slower division than the other 3. So it's going to attack 5 hours later the next day. So here's the situation. It's the 27th of August, 2nd day of the offensive. Objective is to take the Fresnes-Rouvroy line, that yellow line that you see, but the Corps again expects at least the DQ line will fall in the process. Defenders consist of the 35th Division to the north. The 214th is effectively eliminated. There's the 39th that's acting as the shock absorber for the 26th Reserve Division. So the 3rd Division attacks at 5. Its 7th Brigade hits a soft spot in the German defenses, partly because of that counterattack the previous day. They end up capturing Vis-en-Artois. However, the 9th Brigade gets stuck at the Bois de Sort and is unable to take the Fresnes-Rouvroy line. It was too shallow, too short of a barrage. It just was not able to overcome the resistance. The Germans launched a series of battalion-sized counterattacks that ultimately were defeated, but they did have an impact in slowing the Canadian advance. To the south, the 2nd Division attacks at 10 with a handful of tanks that all broke down. The 4th and 5th Brigades reached the Sensee River and overrun the 39th. The division has not done particularly well, and the division commander is tasked with writing a detailed report as to why his division failed. After a short pause at the river, the Canadian infantry continues their advance. They don't have artillery support in the form of a barrage. They have to advance up the bare slope to the Fresnes-Rouvroy line, where they are cut to ribbons by the German machine gun fire. The 5th Brigade's 22nd Battalion loses its commander. All of the battalions engaged suffer fairly heavy casualties and disorganization. So by the end of the day, the results are far less impressive than the previous day, and the Germans are still holding the Fresnes-Rouvroy line. So at this point, 3rd day of the offensive, Currie decides to keep the 2 divisions in. He again is still pretty optimistic as to how things are going to transpire. He expects that the DQ line will fall. two very different approaches to this battle for the next day. So here it's the 35th and 26th Reserve Divisions. They're continuing to hold the line. Notice that the 39th is the second division to be pulled off the map. The 3rd Division commander makes a series of sequential attacks on a narrow front, dense barrage with smoke. I'm beginning to sound like a broken record here, but it's exactly what they did. So all 3 brigades attack on narrow fronts. They break through the German positions and roll them up. The 35th makes a couple feeble counterattacks, but it's effectively destroyed. Ludendorff, the de facto commander of the German army, is outraged by what had happened, and he demands and gets von Krebnitz, the division commander's head. And somewhat unfairly, because the 35th actually performed fairly well considering the limitations it was operating under. To the south, the 2nd Division commander approaches things very differently. He is going to make essentially the same attack as he did yesterday, with a barrage, but no smoke. It's going to be a fairly weak barrage, and the result is exactly the same as the previous day, except this time all 3 battalion commanders of the 5th Brigade are either killed or wounded. The 22nd Battalion, the Van Duys, march out of this battle, led by the regimental medical officer, followed by 40 men. So as you can see, the 2nd has taken a really bad battering as a result of this battle. So northern part of the Fresnes-Rouvroy line has fallen, but not the southern at the end of this. So this leads to 2 more themes: command success and command errors. So the 3rd Division was led by a British regular army officer, Louis Lipsett. He had decided to do the sequential attacks for 2 reasons. One is he didn't have enough artillery to attack simultaneously. The 3rd Division was attacking on a front that 1.5 British divisions were expected to defend. So he had to concentrate the barrage in sequence. Further, he did not think the Germans would be able to shift their artillery in time, and he was correct. Behind that concentrated barrage with the smoke, it was very effective, and we'll talk more about that later. On the other hand, the Canadian Permanent Force officer, Henry Burstall, is wildly optimistic about what his division can accomplish. He leaves in the battered 5th Brigade. He makes a broad front attack with a weak barrage. He doesn't use smoke. This is another result of not having that open warfare training. The 2nd Division decided not to use smoke after the first day because it confused the infantry. The result is the division success rate suffered greatly. Plus, this division attacked 5 hours late. So that's at this point, the 2nd and 3rd Divisions are burned out and need to be replaced. The 4th British and 1st Canadian arrive on the scene. So now we enter the 2nd phase, nibbling, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. I first want to talk about 2 other themes, one of which is why the Canadians did not attack on the 29th of August, and that was because of road congestion resulting in shortage of ammunition at the battery level. There was ample ammunition at the supply heads on the other side of Arras, but it was just really difficult to get the supplies through the bad roads, bad Canadian road discipline, and just the distance that they had to follow. So there had to be a pause in the offensive. What saved the Canadians was that they were allowed to extend their light rail networks in both north and the southern sectors, with the result that on the 30th, the offensive could resume. The other factor is communications, and that while the communications were a lot better in 1918 than they were previously, they're still fragile and uneven. So there are instances where the communication breakdown happened, such as on the 26th when the 7th Brigade received word to move up too late or with a considerable delay. But there are other instances where Canadian battalions are able to call down artillery in minutes on an unexpected position. So, and it's also uneven in the sense that battalions have a much better handle of what's going on on their front. Corps has a good idea what's going on, but brigades and divisions seem to lag by hours from what the situation is actually going on. And if someone wants to discuss this more, I'd be happy to do so during the Q&A session. So why am I talking about nibbling? Well, because the next phase is Canadian Corps has to reach this dashed line. It's the jump-off point for the Canadian attack on the DQ line scheduled for the 2nd of September. It has to be that close so that there's a reasonable chance for the infantry to get to the DQ line, but it also needs to be close enough that the field artillery will have sufficient range that the barrage can extend through the full depth of the DQ line. So Currie has 3 days to get to that line. He can't use tanks. He has to preserve his ammunition supply, and the divisions that he has available, he's going to get one more, the 4th Canadian, that's moving up. So he can't afford to suffer heavy casualties or exhaustion because he has to use these divisions in the attack on the DQ line. The German defenders now consist of the 26th Reserve Division. You'll notice the 35th is no longer on the battle. And backstopping it is the 4th Ersatz Division, and 3 battalions of which are deployed with the 26th Reserve. 4th Ersatz was never a particularly great division, but it suffered heavily during the German spring offensives, so it's in a pretty sad shape. South of it is the 111th Division. It has 2 regiments available. The 3rd is fighting in the British division. It's an average division. So the offensive opens with the 4th Division at 5 in the morning. It takes Hawkor, reaches St. Servant's Farm, but German counterattacks drive it back. The 1st Division is tasked with taking the Fresnes-Rouvroy line south of its junction with the Vise and Artois switch. So that's the responsibility of the 1st Brigade under Billy Griesbach. He's going to try a very different approach than Burstall did. So he does a head-on attack with the 3rd Battalion at the junction behind a dense barrage with smoke. Again, same kind of idea here over and over again. And it's successful. He breaks into the German position, attracts all of their attention, while 2 battalions loop through the British sector and race north, rolling up the German lines. And German accounts are really clear. These are contemporary reports of what a shock it was. They have survivors from the previous position running through their position saying that, Tommies are coming, the Tommies are coming. And they don't believe it. And then all of the mist comes Canadians firing Lewis guns from their hips. There's grenades. There's all sorts of mayhem. And the Germans have a choice of either surrendering or dying in the spot. As a result, the 26th suffers really badly in this battle, and it will no longer be combat effective. So at the end of the, by mid-morning, this is the situation. Canadians and the British have made some good progress. So Griesbach decides to set up his defensive position along this red dashed line. Now, some of you may notice what's defending the section from the end of the red dashed line to the boundary with the 3rd Army. It's 2 platoons. The Germans pick up on this, and they have a full-strength active division, the 16th, that's fresh, and they quickly identify this opportunity and take advantage of it. So they send 2 regiments of the 16th crashing and overrunning those 2 platoons. They break a number of Canadian units to the point the commander of the 2nd Battalion has to pull out his pistol to rally the troops. He does, slows the Germans down, and they're stopped just on the outskirts of Upton Wood, at which point heavy artillery, field artillery, machine guns, Lewis guns, all of that you've heard before starts to take a terrible toll on the Germans. There's a barrage that drops across the German rear line, limiting the transit of supplies and reinforcements. And the Germans report that they lost an entire battalion headquarters wiped out by Canadian sniper fire. The Canadians marshaled reserves and then counterattacked and drove the Germans back to the start line. All of which is to say, this was the perfect opportunity for a German counterattack, a fresh, excellent division at full strength in place of an unprotected flank, and it's defeated. In fact, the 2 regiments that made this attack will collapse when they're attacked again in 2 days' time. So let's talk about two themes here. I had mentioned this earlier about the importance of the field artillery barrage. So in writing the book on which this presentation is based, I looked at all 83 battalion level attacks made by the Canadian Corps, that's British and Canadian units in this battle, and assessed it against 40 different factors. And what I found was that if the field artillery barrage had a density of less than 30 meters, lower number is better, there was a 97% success rate. If there was smoke, it's 100%. Whereas if there was no barrage, there was a 33% failure rate. So a concentrated field barrage, and it didn't matter how good the defenses, how good the defenders, how fresh they were, Canadians would always win. The other factor is the power of the infiltration tactics. And this is from German contemporary and post-war accounts. And it's a pretty similar story. They are mowing Canadians down to the front. They're stacked as high as the eye can see. And then out of the smoke come the Canadians, come the grenades, come the Lewis guns, and it's a disaster. The Canadians are able to isolate and then annihilate these German positions. And machine gun posts. It was very potent, according to the German accounts. So, second day of the nibbling phase, Canadians have to keep advancing. So the defenders now, the 16th Infantry Division is now put in the front line. It replaces the battered 26th Reserve. So 4 divisions down now. You have the 4th Ersatz has moved north of the Arras-Cambrai Road. And you'll notice that there's a new division in the upper right-hand corner, 2nd Guards Reserve Division. And you might think, wow, Guards, these guys got to be good. Well, in fact, they're a very mediocre division. One of its regiments consists of 2 battalions, 225 strong each. The regimental commander highlights to his superiors just how quickly they're going to collapse if attacked. They were left in, and they will collapse on the 2nd of September. And there's a lot of angry finger pointing that results out of this battle from that regiment being left in place. So another attack by the 4th Division. It takes St. Servan's Farm. The 2nd Brigade strikes north and takes the Fresnes-Rouvroy line and tries to bounce to the dashed line, but is prevented by German reserves moving up. So now we have a situation, you can see we're getting closer. We got 1 day left before the big attack. So 2 things I want to mention here. The first is I mentioned much earlier talking about the lack of coordination and synchronization. There was a consistent pattern, especially with the British, where Canadian units would attack and then the British unit would attack. And if they attacked together, they would have been successful, but instead they're defeated in detail by the Germans. There was a particularly bad level of cooperation with the 17th Corps. Currie, the Canadian commander, and Ferguson, the commander of the 17th Corps, neither liked nor respected each other. The other dimension is the Canadians just had a better organization. Their divisions were 50% larger than a British division. So that meant they had more infantry, more engineers, more artillery, more machine guns, more of everything. They also had additional units that greatly aided the Canadians' ability to hit harder and hit longer than could a British division. So final day of the nibbling. Got to get to that dash line. 4th Canadian Division is now in place. It takes over some of the front from the British and 1st Canadian divisions. But the commander of the 4th British, Matheson, has to report to Currie that his 10th Brigade is no longer combat effective. He's now reduced to 2 brigades for the big offensive. Defenders consist of the same cast of characters as we had before. Attack early in the morning. 4th makes some good progress to the south. The 1st Division attacks with 3 battalions and overruns those 2 regiments that I had mentioned earlier from the 16th. One Canadian battalion commander said he had never seen the Germans fight so poorly. So they reach the dash line. The German Corps commander cannot allow this to stand. he launches the reserve regiment of the 16th Infantry against the 7th Battalion of the 29th, or pardon, the 2nd Brigade, and it pushes its 7th Battalion all the way back to the start line. But the 7th, like a spring, it coils, it springs back with only minimal reinforcements, no artillery support. It drives the Germans all the way back to the start line. The German Corps commander is not done. He throws in his last reserve in that sector, the 3rd Reserve Division with 2 regiments. They attack in the early, or probably late afternoon, and again are pounded by artillery, machine gun fire, and they end up trying to defend a series of shell holes in front of the Canadian positions, in front of the DQ line, but they're not tied in, they're not well organized, and they will suffer the next day as a result of this. This all brings to mind an important consideration, and that is German errors. So the Canadians are facing the 2nd Bavarian Corps, commanded by Conrad Kraft von Dellmensingen. He is a star in the Bavarian army. He was the chief of staff of that army. Prior to the war, he holds important chief of staff positions at army and army group level. He commanded the Alpen Corps in the Romanian campaign that was so successful for the Germans. He was the chief of staff of the German army at Caporetto, which again was so successful. However, during the 100 Days campaign, and especially Operation Mars, the attempt to take Arras, he was far less successful. Ludendorff's not pleased, and he gets demoted to command the 2nd Bavarian Corps. So the defensive scheme that the Germans are using, and it's important to understand this where we'll talk about the errors, is that it consists of 3 zones. There's the Vorfeld or forward zone that's to act as a shock absorber, where a combination of interlocking machine gun fire and field artillery attrits the attacker to the extent that by the time they reach the main defensive zone, they are so weakened they cannot make any further advance, at which point counterattack divisions deployed in that 3rd position, along with the field artillery, slam into the attacking Allied forces and throw them back to their start line. But that breaks down in this battle because, first, as a result of the artillery losses, field artillery losses at Amiens and 2nd Marne, the Germans move their field artillery further to the rear, so they cannot reach that Vorfeld. As a result, much of the firepower they were relying on to attrit the attackers has been removed from the scheme. The other dimension of what happens is that Dellmensingen is determined to retake the Vorfeld. He throws all his reserves again and again, the attack on the 26th of August, the attack on 30th, the attack on the 2nd. He burns out his reserves in trying to retake this. And in most cases, these counterattacks are very costly failures. Of the 12 well-attested battalion or greater size counterattacks, that is, that we can match German records to Canadian and British records, only 3 of the 12 were even moderately successful, and they had no operational consequence. The other 9 may have had some initial success, like the attack of the 16th, but in the end, they all fail with great cost to the attackers, disorganization, and demoralization. So now we arrive at the culmination, the DQ line. So Currie has 3 divisions. The 4th, two brigades left, tired. 4th Canadian's fresh. 1st Canadian has been fighting for 3 days. This will be its 4th day of battle, so it is tired as well. What Currie plans is essentially 2-phase operation. The expectation is that the battle is going to be for the DQ line. That's where the Germans are going to deploy their reserves. That's where the hard fighting is going to be. So the attack is to go in at 5 in the morning and reach that red line. That's the limit of the field artillery barrage. At this point, most of the German forces should have been destroyed, and at 8 o'clock, reserves move forward to resume the offensive. Expectation is that it is going to be a pursuit operation like the latter stages of Amiens on the 8th and on the 9th of August, and that across the canal and reach that black line. Cambrai is located off the screen to the lower right-hand corner. Defending the DQ line are six divisions, five of which we've discussed. And there's a new one that's showing up, the 1st Guards Reserve Division. This is a full-strength Guards unit. It is an excellent division. It's been heavily reinforced with marksman detachments. It's a very different beast from the 2nd Guards Reserve Division. Attack opens at 5, and somewhat surprisingly, it's very successful. Now, there's some hard fighting, but the entire DQ line falls on time, not a lot of casualties. And this is the result of a combination of Canadian tactics, tanks, field artillery barrage, smoke. The defenses are not as strong as thought, and the defenders are, in some cases, very weak. They've been expended in trying to keep the Canadian Corps away from the attack on the DQ line. And contrary to what the expectation is, the 1st Guards Reserve Division is not deployed. It's left defending in depth beyond the DQ line. At 8 o'clock, the attack resumes, and the 4th Canadian and the 4th British run into a buzzsaw. The Germans are able to inflict very heavy losses and disorganization as they advance down the gentle slope of Mount Currie. It's interesting to note that the 4th Division suffered more fatal casualties in this one day than the other 3 Canadian divisions did in their 3 or 4 days of fighting. So you can see the extent of the damage that's done. Now, Currie had come up with a force that he was going to use in expectation that the Germans had collapsed. It's called the Canadian Independent Force. It consisted of a cavalry regiment, 2 Canadian motor machine gun brigades, cyclist, artillery. They were going to race down the Arras-Cambrai road and seize bridgeheads across the Canal du Nord at Marcoing. They never got on track. The cavalry regiment that led the force suffered 3 men wounded. Units on either side of it suffered 100 times those kind of casualty figures. So not much of an effort by the Canadian Independent Force. To the south, the 1st Division continued its attack with the 2nd and 3rd Brigades, and after a lot of very, very hard fighting, ended up taking the Bussy Switch. One of the battalions of the 2nd, the 10th, fought for 15 hours, and it had multiple different tactics it used at different stages in the battle to reach its goal. Just to illustrate how optimistic the planners were, they thought that 10-hour battle should only last for 2.5 hours. So at the end of the day, the situation was this: Currie, realizing that they had not accomplished everything they wanted to resume the offensive. But the 1st Division makes no attempt to attack the next day. The 4th starts going through the motions, but realizes it's too disorganized to do so, and persuades Currie to delay the attack by a day. It didn't matter, because by this point, the Germans had already crossed the canal. At the end of the battle, von Dellmensingen had lost 5 of the 6 divisions he started with. The one remaining, the Guards Reserve Division, was badly battered. One of its regiments was effectively destroyed at this point. There was no way that he was going to be able to defend, and Ludendorff gave the reluctant approval to fall back behind the Canal du Nord, which triggered a retreat on the front of 2 German armies to fall back across the canal. And it would take the next day, most of the day, for the Canadians to reach the canal, at which point it was clear the battle was over. So 2 last themes I want to talk about. The first is insufficient forces. According to GHQ standard doctrine, the Canadians had 1/4 to half of the infantry that they should have had for this attack. Currie asked for additional, or at least for the front to be shrunk down for the attack on the 2nd. Haig turned it down. With the result, the Canadians were attacking on frontages that British divisions defended. Canadians Corps had about 2/3 of the artillery concentration of the 3rd and 4th armies. And when there were the handful of times there were tanks available, in only 12% of these cases were the sufficient tanks to meet standard doctrine. Haig seriously underestimated the extent of the German defenses and forces available. The other is the insufficient infantry firepower, and this is really highlighted by what happened to the 4th Division when it tried to advance without any artillery support, or at least without a barrage at 8 o'clock on the 2nd of September. The Canadian infantry, just like British infantry, didn't have the firepower to suppress defenses in depth. They didn't have the reach or the firepower to do so. Now, Canadian battalions, in theory, were supposed to be assigned additional resources, a machine gun battery. Often they never actually synced up, and if they showed up, they ran out of ammunition, and they were not all that aggressively handled when compared to German machine gunners. Trench mortars were very effective, but the crew could fire all the ammunition they could carry in a minute, and the field artillery, when it showed up, could be powerful in suppressing point targets, but a single section of 2 guns is not going to be able to suppress defenses that are out to 800 meters in depth. As a result, the 4th Division ran into a lot of problems. So, conclusion. This was a major but not decisive victory. The Canadians would not reach Cambrai until late September, but it was still significant, or a major victory in that 2 German armies had to retreat. It was a surprising victory. We've already talked about the resources available and the fact that the Corps, and this includes the British units fighting with it, did quite surprisingly well, given the depth of German defenses and the number of units that they had to face. It was also superb that there were mistakes, there were errors, and I talk about them in the book that this presentation is based on. But overall, it truly was a superb performance. It was also significant. And here you're going to have to allow me a counterfactual. So prior to the attack on the DQ line, Haig was warned by the chief of the Imperial General Staff that if the Canadian attack failed with heavy casualties, Haig would lose his job. And because at this point in the war, London, both military and the political figures, believed the war could not be won in 1918. They wanted to keep the British Army intact for 1919, so they probably would have selected a commander that would not have launched attacks, and so the war would have lasted longer. But even if Haig somehow survived, or whoever they selected persuaded the government to continue the offensive, without the DQ line, the offensive would have been delayed. You first had to take it, then you could launch the attack across the Canal du Nord. That would have extended the advance well into October, well into November, when the weather was terrible, flu was a factor. It could have meant that the Germans would have lasted long enough through the winter to the spring. Why is this important? The Germans were defeated. There's no question whether it was in November or in January or in March or April, the Germans were defeated. But consider on the 11th of November, when the armistice is declared, there is soon revolution in Russia. There's revolution in Munich, in Berlin, in Hungary. There are strikes everywhere. All the major unions in England go on strike at a point in the next few months. There's a febrile, fervent environment. There is immense pressure building up that's looking for release. Now imagine another 3 to 4 months of war, what that would have entailed. The Canadian Prime Minister, Robert Borden, wrote in his diary his concerns that the center would not hold. So you imagine what would have happened with more time and more war. We could be living in a very different world. And that's why this is a significant victory. Now, a short advertisement. This presentation is based on my book, The Hardest Battle, published by Hellion. It consists of a 484-page book full of descriptions and analysis and descriptions of both German, British, and Canadian actions. And there's also a full-color map book, which the presentation was based. Unfortunately, we don't have the technology to animate them, but I think they're still very, very useful. So you can pick it up from Hellion, from the bookseller, online. At this point, I'll hand it back to David, and we can launch the question and answer section. Thank you.
Bill, thanks very much indeed. That was tremendous, really fast-paced and interesting talk. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and I'm sure everybody will agree. If you agree that you enjoyed it, please join in a round of applause virtually by pressing the raise hand button. And I can confirm, Bill, that there's hundreds of hands going up as a silent round of applause.
Excellent.
It's a few months since I've done that one, isn't it? So there we go. Tremendous. It's Q&A time, everybody. So we've got some questions in already.
Hi, John.
Hey, Bill, that was terrific. First of all, just before I ask the question, David, I want to congratulate and thank you for resuming these webinars. That's they're terrific. So thanks again.
Thanks,
Bill, that
John.
was really good. And one of the things I'm really impressed of in your presentations is how much knowledge you have of the opposition and how that really adds to the presentations. Now, I want to ask a question that's maybe a little more broad about the 100 days, about casualties. You know, when you're doing or creating seminars related to the First World War, a lot of people are new to it, and when they're presented with the SOM, the first thing they hear about is casualty rates, and then it goes on from there. When they come to the last 100 days, including this battle, they hear about open warfare, moving quickly, Germans not in great shape, et cetera, and again, you present how there are pockets of really good German divisions, units, but the presentations often don't even mention casualty rates when they're talking about the last 100 days. And
Right.
People are surprised when they hear how large they were. And
Yes,
so based on the research you've done, you know, what would you say were the 2 or 3 major reasons for the high casualty rates? And then the second question may be related. How effective were the artillery in keeping up with the advances and being able to effectively mount barrages?
Okay, so regarding casualty rates, one of the big differences is that the number of attacks that were made is dramatically higher than on the Somme. So Canadian units fighting on the Somme typically lost 50% of the men and 75% of the officers in making an attack. It's markedly lower. It's more like about 25, 35% in these battles. Now, it varies depending. The 22nd, for instance, is not a great example of a successful operation, but the part of it is that they just make more attacks. Like there's 13 times the rate of attacks during this period, the 10 days, than during the close to 90 days that the Canadians fought on the Somme. So it's not that each attack is more costly. It's actually considerably less costly. It's just there's so much more of them. They're attacking every day as opposed to waiting for 4 or 5 days in between. Another dimension of this is that the nature of casualties do change, is that German artillery is not as effective as on the Somme or during Passchendaele. And the result is that casualties tend to be more from machine gun fire, etc. So you'll see that in some cases, the death number of wounded to dead is like 6 to 1 versus the Somme where it's 2 to 1. So for every 1 killed, there are 2 wounded. Higher the number, that means is that people are not suffering as much, obviously not dying at the same rate. And a lot of that is a factor of artillery kills. Machine guns kill, but they also wounded at a much higher rate than does the artillery. You had 2 parts to the I forgot the second part. Sorry.
Oh, the other one was how effective were the artillery in keeping up with the pace during the last 100 days?
Well, I mean, there were limits. There was a bit of a debate, like the attack on the DQ line. The Canadians decided that they were not going to move up their field artillery. They were going to make that attack at 8 without any field artillery barrage support, because it would just take too long. It would mean that there would be like a 6-hour delay before they could move up. They're a lot faster than they used to be, but they are still not, like contemporary times. The other dimension to this is that as the Canadians advanced, the very heavy artillery was left on the Vimy sector, because trying to move like a 9-inch howitzer would tie up the road for a full day when you needed that road to move ammunition. So the heavy artillery, like they're super heavy, tended to fall behind. The 6 and 8 inch could keep up, but anything heavier than that was left behind.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that. Michael Charter, Michael, we might have covered your question in that, but if we haven't, just by all means drill down further into your question.
You did, but I have a different question, which is the involvement of the tanks. Obviously, you mentioned at the beginning the terrain wasn't suitable for them, but then you mentioned in the later days they did appear. I was just wondering how much, was it battalion strength tanks, or was that a major factor or not?
It certainly helped on the DQ line. At that point, they managed to cobble together 50 tanks. Every other battle where they had an operation, they would have a handful, like 3 or 4 per brigade, and they almost invariably either got knocked out or broke down. They weren't very useful. I mean, it's completely different. This is a very different battle, but it did have an impact. That you read the German accounts, they have a thing called tank Schrecken, tank fear, and I swear, every German regimental history talks about the Canadians having tanks that darken the sky. Somehow they pop up, and they keep showing up in accounts when there wasn't a tank closer than 20 kilometers. So it was inside the Germans' head, but there weren't actually that many that participated in the battle. And often they were not particularly useful. They were often rapidly knocked up because they were being used in such small numbers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for that. Tremendous. Terry, you've got a good question there. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi,
Hi.
from Ontario. How are you?
Ah, great. How's the weather?
It's not bad. It's not bad. I don't know, depending on your point of view, either you're really happy that the Owls won or you're really sad. I'm kind of in the middle. But so my question for you is communication. So I've done research that suggests that during the 100 Days battle, the Canadians basically they outstripped their ability to communicate effectively. So they, part of that problem was, so their phone lines are being decimated by bombardment. They have linemen who are going out constantly trying to fix the line. They are targets of sniping. So we've got that part of it. We've got, runners who were trying to get messages ahead, but they can't because the roads are impassable. Then you have like heliographs, which are fantastic and do work during the daytime, just saying. But, they're kind of, they're good in the sense that if you want to be a target, yeah, sure, go ahead and use one. But they were, my understanding was that they were using them. And then the last thing that the Canadians were using were the shutter boards. So can you talk a little bit more about the role
Sure.
of communication?
Yeah, so there were times that there were definitely problems with communications. For instance, on the attack by the 4th Division on the DQ line, division commander had decided to remain too far back, and so they were relying on actually wireless. They had to set up 2 relay stations to keep them in touch. One of the brigades that was critical to this attack, their radio was knocked out like 12 minutes into the battle. And so they were left without any level of communications. There were a lot of issues with communication, especially for artillery. Sometimes you would have artillery division headquarters that didn't have enough communications to manage 2 brigades, or having to manage 7 field artillery brigades and 2 heavy artillery brigades. So that created a whole set of issues. Now, there were times like the heliograph. I mentioned that example of the Canadian battalion signaling back. They had an advanced battalion headquarters signal back, got communications hooked up to the network and artillery is called in very quickly. But then you have cases where no one knows what's going on at the front because they can't get that through. One of the differences, certainly between 17 and 16, is that the Germans just don't have the shells to fire in the rear, like where they would be breaking stuff. So there are times where the Canadians just have everything, just like on telephone poles. And so that keeps it away from, the infantry and cavalry and everything else knocking stuff out. And you don't have much of a threat of the German artillery knocking it out. But there is still an issue. There are just not enough resources assigned to it. One of the advantages the Canadians did have is that Currie had asked for more signalers, and the British High Command, for whatever reason, said, no, you can't do it. He just added 12,000 anyways. So, it's like one of these surreptitious things of, well, you're not going to give them to me, I'm just going to grab them anyways. And the Canadian organization said, yeah, absolutely. And so that's, again, one of those things that the Canadians could get away with. Being a semi-national, semi-autonomous force, they could pull stuff off that a British Corps commander would never be allowed to do so. So yeah, it's a really complex story. It's good, it's bad, it's indifferent. At one point, the British Second Army complained that the Canadians were getting all of the continuous wave radios. That was like the latest technology, the sort of 5G of that era, and they complained that the Canadians got them all. That when the Canadian Corps moved to Arras, they had to turn off their radios because the Corps they were replacing didn't have any of this advanced technology. So it'd be a sure clue to the Germans, Canadians are here. So.
Okay, yeah, because I had understood too, and then I promise I'll be quiet. So the Canadians were a little more open to trying new things like radio and all those newfangled technologies, where the Brits were a little more reluctant.
I'm a Canadian, and I like to say, yeah, Canada, but I think we also have to acknowledge that these decisions are made at the Corps level, which is at a different level where, the chief of the communications in BF is way back and is an old fart and doesn't really understand any of this. So British officers would have been happy to embrace this, but they often didn't have the resources or the liberty to take on this stuff. So, but certainly the Canadians were willing to embrace it and take advantage of all of that.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Terry. Right. We've got a question that's coming from Bob Linnell, but Bob can't join us on the Zoom, so I'll ask the question for Bob. Bob said, great talk. How would you rate Watson, the commander of the 4th Division?
Well, Watson is an interesting story. So he is a staunch member of the Conservative Party, a good friend of the former minister. He gets his position probably in large part because of his ties to the party. He does grow somewhat as a division commander, but his division seems to suffer a lot of bad things happen to its battalions. There's just this continual example of battalions running into buzzsaws and heavy casualties. Now, in the case of the DQ, a lot of historians have criticized him heavily for what occurred. He did have in his diary that he thought the plan was not a very good one, but he didn't stand up to Currie and say no. I would say he was one of the weaker. I think in this battle, Burstall was the weakest by far, then Watson, then MacDonnell, and Lipsett was the best division commander, the British officer.
Okay, thanks for that, Bill. Right, Gordon, you're on. You want to just unmute yourself?
Thank you, David. Excellent. That I thoroughly enjoyed that, Bill. A really interesting subject that you're covering there. My question is, would you consider that many of the German divisions had lost quality this late in the war and were manned with less effective officers and men? And had this battle been fought earlier, would there have been a different outcome?
Certainly the Germans are weaker. but you have to be careful. There's units like the 91st Reserve Infantry Regiment with 2 battalions of 225 men that are on the verge of mutiny. But then you've got units like the 1st Guards Reserve Infantry Regiment that's going to fight to the last man. So it's very uneven. I'd say generally German morale is like a step below what it used to be, but something that, at least from my observations of doing an in-depth study on the Somme and here, so when the Germans think they have the advantage, they fight hard. But when they think they've lost the advantage, they'll fall back. A lot of the problems that Germans are having is that they're just trying to man too much ground with not enough forces. They just don't have a density. So that allows the Canadian infiltration tactics, and the ones used by the British as well, to be effective if they had greater density. So certainly morale is a function, but I think the 17,000 casualties the Canadian Corps suffered in this battle is indicative that somebody sure as hell fighting, and that there are defeats. The Canadians and the British suffered defeats in this. So for me, it's yes, there's actually, the Canadians are using less materiel on that same front than did the British in First Arras. The Germans have more machine guns. So it's not a matter of, they've got more materiel. Morale certainly a factor, and manpower is a bit of an issue. But when the Canadians, and I use this, both British and Canadians in this sense, when they use the right tactics, they're always successful. Right. So there's a situation. If you use the right method, boom, you're golden. But if you don't, bad things can happen.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for your reply.
Good question.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Gordon. Glenn.
Yeah, okay. Great stuff, Bill, as normal, listening to you. I understand that 22nd Corps, who are on the Canadians' left flank and to the north, played a supporting role in the operation. Could you explain what the supporting role was and how successful, if it was, to the Canadian operation?
Right. So the way the battle opened is the Canadians commanded the 51st Highland, which was north of the Scarpe. And the 51st Highland had to take high ground that overlooked the Canadian advance. And because the 51st, for a whole variety of reasons, was not as strong as it used to be, took a while to take that. And that held up the Canadian advance for a while because they could not push their artillery up. Otherwise, it would be exposed to German artillery fire. Currie was managing way too long of a front, and he persuaded Haig that he needed to cut it down. So the 51st Highland passed to the 22nd Corps, which was at that point uncommitted, and it took over a good chunk of the Canadian sector. Now, there was no offensive operations on that. The Germans weren't going to attack, and there was nothing strategic value or operational value to attack on from the Allied side. So their mission was just to hold the front and make sure that no nonsense comes from the Germans. And in that, they were successful.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks very much. And Bill, do you want to unmute yourself?
Bill, thank you very much. It was a great talk. My question really is about air power. Now, you mentioned that the RAF aircraft were used in support of repelling counterattacks to the north, I think on day 2 or 3. You then described the development of the Canadian Independent Force, which obviously didn't very much materialize. And there was a photograph that you used that had a convoy of vehicles with what seemed to be white air marker panels strapped to the bonnets. Yep. I guess you'd call them hoods. Was air power used extensively, both for close air support and then also maybe in terms of reconnaissance, picking up the move forward of these various German reserves as they're coming in?
Well, reconnaissance throughout the First World War was by far the most crucial dimension of what the Air Force did. It was tracking stuff. But because of the pace of operations, there wasn't those long pauses where you could build out use the reconnaissance to develop where the positioning of all the German units, etc. What tended to happen is because the Canadians were advancing into effectively a salient, there were a lot of complaints that the Germans would send 30, 40 fighters scooting through the line and strafe anything standing, and then they would disappear before the RAF could could deal with them. So the RAF's main task was the reconnaissance. They did do some bombing and some strafing, but from the accounts, I didn't see that the Germans registered it much. There certainly weren't a lot of complaints. There were certainly a lot of complaints from the Canadian side about these German strafing raids coming over. And there was really nothing the RAF could do about it. You just had to grin and bear it. So even though, in comparison to, say, First Arras, that there was a greater disparity in the number of aircraft, the aircraft were not decisive in this engagement. The Canadians had a pretty good sense of what the Germans had at the front and what was moving up, from various sources, including aerial reconnaissance. And you take a look at, sort of the situation maps and their planning. Usually they had a fairly good idea of what the Germans had, and thanks to that. The Germans, on the other hand, had no clue what they were facing. At one point, I read the diary of von Delmensing, and he thought he faced 4 Canadian divisions and 2 British divisions at the same time. At no point did the Canadian Corps have more than 3 divisions in the front line. And some of his actions may have been contingent that, all 4 Canadian divisions are in line, I can afford to commit my reserves to regain my Vorfeld, not recognizing he was only facing at most 2 Canadian divisions at any time in the battle. In fact, the Germans didn't pick up the Canadians were there until the 3rd day of the battle.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill, for that question. Right. I think that's it in terms of the questions that we've got for Bill. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can just do a final round of applause now for Dr. Bill Stewart for that tremendous presentation about operational history, which I think is absolutely fantastic. That's our bread and butter, talking about battles and that kind of thing. So Bill, is stacks of hands going up again as a silent round of applause. So I think in the famous words of the cartoon, that's all, folks, and we'll call it an evening, or if you're in a different time zone, call it a day at that point. Bill, thanks very much indeed for. Well,
thank you for everyone listening and all the very good questions. It was most enjoyable.
Thanks very much, and let's hope that there's quite a few takers for your book as well, which will be, I'm sure, really interesting and well worth the purchase. So thanks very much, Bill. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
everybody. See you later. Bye now. Bye.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières.